when I was in school, you had to memorize because I didn't have Google in my hand. So I think about it even today, and I use it as an example. You're sitting there going, who's that one actor in that one movie? And you're trying, and you don't have enough facts, and you're kind of working with somebody enough to make a Google search to be able to look it up. I think of those kinds of facts to not be super important anymore. And my students struggle with that same thing. If I can just look it up, what do I need to memorize it for?
Jeff, in some ways, you've gone from programming computers to programming human minds.
That was my biggest struggle. I saw the students as programs. If I give them the right input, I'm going to get the right output. And that wasn't always the case. And I started realizing different students I needed to give different inputs to get the desired output. Other teachers might not look at the same level. I can tell you in 30 seconds, if a kid used ChatGPT, I don't even need to read it.
How could you tell, Jeff?
Every paragraph is about the same length.
You seem to be using a lot of AI. How else do you use AI in your classroom?
You could chat with, so originally text with a historical figure. So what I did, my first one I did was with Franklin Roosevelt, and I pulled in multiple Roosevelt biographies along with all primary sources from the Roosevelt Library. And then what happens is I set up the prompts that they can't see underneath the covers that basically says, I want you to pretend like you are Franklin Roosevelt and you are talking to a student that's asking you questions about your life.
Today we're thrilled to welcome Jeff Swisher, award-winning social studies and US history teacher at Griffith High School. Jeff was named Indiana History Teacher of the Year by Gilder Lehrman in 2024. He now serves as a Teacher Plus Indiana Senior Policy Fellow, where he advocates for equity and teacher leadership in policymaking. Jeff blends deep historical understanding with his early career in tech, a former software consultant who helped build systems like Verizon's voicemail and major websites. Jeff now weaves technology, coding, and civic inquiry into his AP US History and dual credit World History classes. In Jeff's world, history isn't just recited, it's lived through simulations, civic projects, coding clubs, and mock trials. We'll talk about how Jeff uses tech to strengthen learning, how he supports student agency and belonging, and what AI and business leaders can learn from the practice of teaching history today. Jeff, welcome to the Inference show.
Thank you. Nice to meet you.
Jeff, tell us a little bit more about your background. How did you go from, doing software and tech to teaching history?
So right when I was in high school, I got my first computer and I was hooked, and I decided technology was the way I was going to go. So I decided to go to college, and I majored in artificial intelligence and mathematics. And for the next almost 20 years, that's what I did. Custom software development, custom architectural development for large Fortune 500s. So I did that for the 20 some years. About 12 years into it, our company decided to add an education division where we would teach companies how to program or how to design software in these specific niche areas. And so I found myself kind of drawn to the education part of it. And so I would teach classes to organizations that wanted to learn how to program in Java or .NET or other specific items. And I found that rather interesting to be able to teach people how to do something. At the same time, my foot was also heavy into tech. So I was doing lots of technology things at the same time. I maybe would teach 1/4, 1/3 of a year would be in that. And the rest of it I would be doing in my normal tech job. So I kind of got a hook for education at that point. The downside of what I did, I was always on airplanes, I was always in hotels, and I was always traveling. And so I one day decided I think I had enough of hotels when I woke up in the middle of the night in a closet trying to find my way to a bathroom. So at that point, I kind of went, this education thing I really kind of liked. So you know what? I came home. I told my wife I wanted to become a teacher. She looked at me like I had just gone crazy. And at that point, knew I did not want to teach computer programming or technology because I kind, not that I got sick of it, but that there was a certain kind of person that you could train in technology, good problem solving skills, and some of those other things. And I had already done enough with high schoolers to know that they had pushed a lot to be in STEM, that STEM was not their gift, as an example. So I had always loved history. And so I decided to go back to school and get a degree in social studies education, and then went back to school again and got a master's in American history. So that was sort of my transition. Working full time that entire time. I'm still not sure how I did it, but ultimately that was my transition to become a teacher.
So, Jeff, and how long did you spend in tech?
About 17, 18 years. I even wrote a book on computer programming. And I was into it pretty heavy.
Great. And then you started your transition into teaching, and you went back to school while working full time.
Yep. And so I went to night schools. So every night after I was done with work, I'd sit in a classroom with a bunch of other college students. And, I'm as old as the professor. So it felt a little awkward sometimes, but I ended up building good relationships with those professors too, which they impacted a lot of how I teach and what I teach, as an example.
Awesome, Jeff. And then you finished your social studies and teaching education, and then you quit your full-time gig and then took up teaching.
Yeah, so I decided to move out of the software development industry and move into education where all the money was. Um, and as a result, we had to make a lot of changes in our lives because, educators don't make anywhere near as much money as I did before. And so, in fact, I think I started as a teacher what I made 17 years ago as a computer programmer before that. So, quite a bit different. But I found myself kind of with that same passion that I had for the computer industry than in education. And the biggest thing is I had to do was temper, because I am a let's try this, let's see if it happens, let's see how it works. And I kind of had to temper things. I didn't want to come in the classroom and like radically change everything, but I did want to make changes that was more my style and who I was.
Understood. And then did you join Griffith Public Schools right away, or?
No, I was at Hammond Public Schools, which is just over the highway, which is a large urban school district. They have 84,000 people in their town. Um, and then this last year, I transitioned from Hammond to Griffith, which is a significantly smaller town, 16,000, one high school. So quite a bit different, even though it is only across the highway. That's the only divider between the two school districts.
And Jeff, how long have you did you teach at Hammond? And it's your first. You finished your first year at Griffith now, right?
Correct. I taught 10 years in Hammond.
So you left your very successful career in tech, followed a passion into teaching, took a gigantic pay cut doing that. But it must have not been easy, not just on the money side. And in our country, teachers struggle a lot with that. That's a consistent topic that comes up. But it's a different career. How was your first year teaching?
It was quite a bit different. The culture was different. I was used to a boss tells you what to do. You do it, and so that culture of a teacher being, for lack of a better term, like an independent contractor within the classroom of a larger school district. Like for a long time, all the teachers made fun of me because I referred to my classroom as my office. And, that was just how I was wired. That was my DNA. And that was surprising to me, and that was hard for me at the same time. Just the different in culture and how things work, and the interrelationship between administration and the teachers can someday cause tension. So I wasn't used to those kinds of aspects. I was used to, if somebody told you something to do, you were like, how high do I need to do it? Because they controlled everything. And so the culture really took me a little bit to get used to, was probably the biggest thing.
Did you feel like school was more stricter, or how was the culture different than a software company, Jeff?
I thought it was more freedom. Um, you, for example, for the most part, both school districts I've been into, I didn't have a lot of micromanagement of how I taught or what I taught. I had standards I had to meet that were part of the state standards, but how my students achieved that and how I measured that they achieved it could be different. And I found that refreshing.
Understood, Jeff. So you experimented a little bit and found your footing there. And how did the students, take you in your first few years? Because you might have been, say, a little bit older than the average teacher, or did they know it's your first year, and did you tell them it's your first year?
Yeah, no, I was not shy about telling them who I was and where I came from. Um, uh, Most of the time I get this is different from a lot of the students. And so, give you an example just of one of the things I did the first year I came in that I wanted to do that was different. 1920s was prohibition, and alcohol was made illegal in the United States. And to help teach my students that, I did a fake speakeasy. Um, so my students had root beer. We learned the gambling that they did in the 1920s. I brought in a dance instructor that taught them the dances of the 1920s. We listened to the music of the 1920s. Um, and we had pineapple upside down cake, which was invented at a speakeasy in New York. So I made it secret so the students didn't know what they were doing. I just said we're going on a secret field trip. I let all the parents know what we were doing, but not to tell the kids. And then, I did that to try and help them to understand what it was like in the 1920s. So I've done that every year since, and typically I get the class that did it last year to be my helpers for the class the next year. And remarkably, they do very well at keeping it quiet, as an example.
That sounds so much fun. That's so different than corporate learning and development that folks, than the classrooms you might have had, while teaching Java or .NET or whatever.
Yeah, yeah. But even then, there's things that you can do that's fun. Like when I was teaching Java, let's write a tic-tac-toe game. Let's see if you can write a computer program that can beat my computer program at playing tic-tac-toe without cheating. And so there's things that you can do to make learning fun, regardless of whether it's for an adult or whether it's for a student. Um, and it was just utilizing those same things, but there's a fine line that I had to balance between what I call edutainment, a version of education where I'm much more entertaining the kids than teaching the kids. And so I have to constantly play with that line to make sure that I don't cross into that area. Kids will enjoy it. They'll want to be there, but I don't think they learn.
Okay, so you have found that there's a line and perhaps crossed it and then tuned it back because ultimately you do get judged on outcomes of the students, right? And their progress.
Correct. Yeah.
So that makes a lot of sense. So, year one, you said it was different. Did you struggle, maintaining all of that rigor and standing up and talking? And
The one thing I personally struggled with is when is enough enough? Um, so when you're writing a computer program to do something, when it produces the outcome you're looking for, it's okay. You don't need to continue to debug it and tweak it and change it, although you can, but as long as it produces the outcome you're looking for. The problem is the students don't work that way. And so I would constantly tweak a lesson plan, or I'd constantly change it, or constantly go, this one thing will make it better. And at some point, I had to go, I've reached my limit and I need to stop. And that was very difficult for me. Um, it was very difficult. If you came to my class first hour, by the time last hour came around, you might not even realize I taught the same lesson because I would radically change it to what I thought would work best by the end of the day. The second thing is um, my college education for education was taught mostly by teachers that have been out of the classroom, didn't like being in the classroom anymore, and thus in college. And so a lot of things they taught us to do weren't things that you do in the classroom anymore, like write a 15-page lesson plan. It not practicable. And so that was the second thing is that tempering what I had learned in college and figuring out how to manipulate it and change it for when your feet are on the ground was probably the hardest thing.
So you were constantly iterating then, thinking of ways and tinkering with it and coming up with new structures, maybe to a point of exhaustion, right?
Yeah, I would say I think that's a good way. I had to decide that, you know, that it's never going to be 100%. I'm never going to produce every student to get the output I desire. And that was the second part of it is, some kids are going to fail. And I used to take it personal when I started. Did I not connect to them? But there's so many other inputs and so many other pressures on students' lives today, especially post-COVID, that I wasn't ready for.
Understood, Jeff. Jeff, if you were to describe your philosophy of teaching history, how would you describe it?
Well, my philosophy of teaching history is a little bit different than my philosophy of history. My philosophy of teaching history is I tell all my students that really my class is about reading and writing within the context of history. The better you can read, the more quickly you can read and pull in information, and the more easily you can then contextualize it, relate it, and communicate it back. Thus, in writing, that is really the goal of my class. Is reading and writing. Just happens to be around history. There's history standards they need to know, but I focus mostly on those things. And now I've expanded a lot. They still will be doing a lot of reading, but how they decide to present that they understand that information, I do more ways now with technology. So I move away than just writing. They might do a commercial, for example. They might do a video. They might do a presentation. They might do a play. They might do a trial. So there's different ways that I have them represent or demonstrate that they've learned that information. But it's still basically the same class.
I see. And then the fun part for the students, or it's just not limited to, say, writing an essay. It's the output that they have to demonstrate in a multitude of ways.
Yeah, so I give them sometimes I tell them this is exactly how I want you to demonstrate it to me. Sometimes I give them flexibility. Pick any of these three ways that you'd like to demonstrate that you have learned this. And or in sometimes I may pick you have to do a presentation. For example, I had them do a presentation with no words. They can only use pictures, and then they had to give that presentation. And so there's all different kinds of ways you can have them demonstrate that they've learned what you've asked them to learn. That gives them some level of flexibility, and technology makes that even easier.
How did the students react to it? Because this is not how they might have studied history earlier, right?
Now, most of the students like that idea. They struggle with the concept of memorization these days, which when I was in school, you had to memorize because I didn't have Google in my hand. Um, so I think about it even today, and I use it as an example. You're sitting there going, "Who's that one actor in that one movie?" And you're trying, and you don't have enough facts, and you're kind of working with somebody enough to make a Google search to be able to look it up. I think of those kinds of facts to not be super important anymore. And my students struggle with that same thing. If I can just look it up, what do I need to memorize it for? And so what they do is they push it into just their short-term memory to be able to pass a test. And the second that test is over, it is evacuated to fill in the new Taylor Swift lyrics. So that is how I started to see my students look at this. And I went, I have to find different ways. So I want them to think about when we're looking at, like an example, Lyndon Johnson did the war on poverty. And so I did with my students, you were hired by Lyndon Johnson. You are now on his cabinet. Here is all the data from that Lyndon Johnson's advisors had to work with from the census, other studies that indicated poverty, what it was like in America. And your job is to make a presentation to Lyndon Johnson on how to fix it. That they remember. Because now they had to put stuff together and they had to analyze and they had to build and they had to come up with ideas and they had to interpret data and figure out how might we solve poverty if we have this same problem today, which we still haven't solved poverty. How might we have ended it then? And so those are the things they remember, not the dates of individual things.
Very interesting, Jeff. This seems to be a very active, immersive, alive classroom where very activity driven rather than you telling them facts and then remembering and they remembering facts and trying to remember facts and putting it in the short term memory. The kids still are, these young adults now who might somewhat be awkward at times and so forth, right? I mean, that's what you sense with high schoolers. Are they're trying to find their place in life now with the expectation that they're going to be on their own soon, right? So it's that
Yeah,
time.
and I think they're kind of still sitting on that. That's one of the things I really saw post COVID is that um, I think they're holding on to their youth a little longer. Like a lot of my students won't get driver's licenses because I think they have this sense of as soon as I start doing that, I'm becoming more of an adult. Um, which when I was a student, we couldn't wait to get our driver's license and that idea of the freedom associated with it. So it's really interesting to see how that concept has changed a bit.
Understood, Jeff. Jeff, in some ways, you've gone from programming computers to programming human minds now, right? And
To a point, that was my biggest struggle. I saw the students as programs. If I give them the right input, I'm going to get the right output. And that wasn't always the case. And so that's one of the things that took me a while. That was like if I overly simplify, that was my ebb and flow that I had when I first started. And I started realizing different students I needed to give different inputs to get the desired output. Some students, no matter how much the input was, I can't get them to connect to it. Um, and I'm not going to ever get the output I desire. And so I kind of had to flow with that and look at my classroom entirely different. Differentiation is a really big thing that I try and use a lot. Some students may not even know that they end up with a slightly different project than somebody else with slightly different requirements because I think that's what they need to stretch and work on.
how do you understand a student, Jeff? When you look at a student and their behavior, how long does it take you to understand what their needs are or what drives them? Or how do you decode a student, Jeff?
So I have like three buckets of students I ended up in history class. I have the ones that are going to get A's no matter what I do, but I want them to move beyond the facts, which they struggle with. Then I have the group that are average students, but as soon as they find a way that they connect to somebody, they start doing well. And then I have the ones that they think they hate history and they have no desire to be here. And I have to find ways to connect with them. I'll give you a perfect example. I had a student that really struggled at doing anything in class. And I sat down one day and I just started talking to him. What's your favorite movies? What's your favorite books you like to read? And granted, he said he never reads, but what music do you listen to? And we started to approach this, and um, I found a topic for him to investigate that he found fascinating. Unit 351 during the World War II was an experimental unit by the Japanese in China, and most of the medical people that were involved in that were brought to the United States and forgiven of any crimes they did. He found that incredibly fascinating. He put together a website for it to show the other students, and he did a presentation in class on it. I counted that as a win once I found what every student has some button that you can push. It just sometimes it takes a while to find that button in some students.
Understood, Jeff. Very, very interesting. And then, Jeff, you say that you describe your classroom as a design lab for learning. Please tell us more and explain that.
So there's two parts. When I started, I was taking things from others. Oh, I like that idea that I saw that teacher did, and so I found that wasn't me. To do what another teacher didn't produce the same results I was looking for. So what I found is I like to try new things. I like to do new things. I like to go to new places. I like to try new meals. So I went, you know what? I'm going to approach my classroom the same way. So I'll give you an example of one that failed recently. Jacob Riis, he's a journalist in the 1800s, and he made a book called How the Other Half Live. And it was to showcase poverty, specifically in New York, and child labor. And so he took pictures throughout all these places and made basically a picture book showing how the other half lived in America. So I thought, you know what? We're going to do how the other half lived in Griffith. So I'm going to have them go out and take pictures throughout the community of things that they thought needed help or needed correction or needed addressing that was not being addressed. I will tell you that totally failed. I had a perfect vision of how it would look. I got a lot of kids that took it as a joke, or I got lots of pictures of potholes. Um, and ultimately, I went, I don't think I'll try that one again, as an example. Um, and I may pull it out and tweak it again later, but I'm going to put that on the back burner, and I'm going to look at this project later. That's what I mean by design lab. If you are in my class this year and you attended my class last year, it will be a different class. We'll have different projects at different times. I'll address things differently. There's very few things I do exactly the same the next year.
Understood, Jeff. Jeff, you've used a class companion, to reimagine how you're giving feedback, and how you develop the feedback loops. Please explain the concept and how you use it.
Okay, so this was my first real big venture into AI for my students to use. So we'll start with that. Uh, I looked at back when I was in college, and I went, if I wrote a paper and submitted it, and I got the grade I wanted, I never looked at anything the professor wrote back. Never even bothered. If I got an A, I didn't care what the professor wrote. They could have wrote, it was garbage, but I gave you an A anyways, and I still wouldn't have read it. So I struggle with that same thing with my students, especially post-COVID. The stamina towards writing is really hard. And so I would have students that wrote a sentence and they would go, I wrote a sentence. Is this a good sentence? I want to make sure I'm not on the wrong track. Is this good? And so I found myself struggling giving students dynamic feedback, one. Two, struggling that when I did give them feedback after the essay was done, it was 3 or 4 days later by the time I read 190 essays and write feedback, knowing full well the students wouldn't read it, but I still wrote it. So Class Companion was my first real big venture into using AI. What you do is you give a student a writing prompt, and as they're writing, they can get feedback, and they can get feedback immediately. And I found the feedback to be phenomenal. What I also liked about it is I could write my own questions, I could write my own rubrics, and it graded against those questions and those rubrics and gave the students really good feedback. And then you could give them time to be able to check and correct it. And so I found that feedback loop to be immediate, to be the biggest changer in my writing in my classroom.
Do you think that's a good use case for AI? Just feedback?
Well, I think feedback right now for students, or I think AI right now for students should be guardrailed. Um, the, I'm not going to give my students ChatGPT and say, go run with it. Um, but this concept of guardrailed AI within specific focused elements, I think is incredibly important and incredibly useful for students. Um, and so Classroom Companion was my first one in that. I played with some others. I've done some others with my students and tried to see what worked and what didn't work. I'm also pulling in my technology background. I've been working on a prototype for using AI for students to communicate to historical figures, as an example. So again, all guardrailed. I'm not going to give them an open AI prompt to go type in whatever they want.
Understood, Jeff. Jeff, you seem to be doing a lot more work in policy today. You're the Teach Plus Indiana Senior Policy Fellow. Please tell us a little bit more about, what does that include? What kind of topics do you talk about, and why that's important for you?
What got me involved in this is I felt like in Indiana, we were passing all these laws about education without listening to the educator. There were parents' voices being heard, and there were business voices being heard, and there was, lobbyists' voices being heard, but the teacher voice was rarely heard. And so I got involved in Teach Plus specifically to try and make sure that the teacher voice was heard by our legislators. So I got involved in a number of different policy things. My big policy group that I worked with, we were a group of 5 other teachers. Indiana completely redesigned their diplomas. And so we were involved in the deployment redesign of the diploma redesign. So we were provided the ability to speak out from a teacher perspective on this is what we think about the new diplomas. This is what we like about it. These are our concerns. We went and did roundtable discussions with other teachers to be able to garner and take their voice and add it to ours. So that was really important to me. Chronic absenteeism is another big one. And so I testified in the House about chronic absenteeism and sort of my idea about chronic absenteeism and what we need to do to try and address that and how important it was. It's not just one student that's missing. If one student's missing, your whole class suffers. So that was sort of my view of it and being able to pass that on to legislators so they can understand.
Understood, Jeff. And what are your current major initiatives there that you're working on?
The one I just finished, and I'm working a little bit still on it, is Indiana and both federal government has a grade that they give to every school. In Indiana, it's called the dashboard. And so I am working on trying to get teacher voice into how to determine whether or not a school is an A, B, C, D, or F school.
Jeff, in all of this, do you make a conscious effort to build relationships with parents? And they have a very important role, right?
Yeah, and in fact, I think they have the most important role. Um, uh, for example, we do a parent um, uh, meeting. We have on the 12th before we have students on the 13th. So I get to meet most of the parents of my students. Um, I try and stay in contact with them as best I can. I try and showcase when they do something well. I have these cards I made up that says history happens here, and I try and write a note positive about every student throughout the semester and send it home. Parental interaction, I think, is the most important part. When I find a student struggling, send a message home. Sometimes you get a response back. Sometimes you get a response back, hey, this is everything that's happening at home. And I go, okay, thank you for letting me know. We'll work on doing stuff differently. And so I think it's important to know that. I tell my students that, you know, I don't care if they're late on an assignment if they let me know ahead of time. It's about planning. And it's about, things happen in our lives that affect our school. And the sooner I know that, the better I can respond to it. I always tell them, I don't want to know afterwards why you didn't get that in on time because you're going to get a 0. But if you tell me beforehand that, my grandma's sick and I'm struggling getting caught up on everything, I'll work around it. But you got to tell me. And so kids are much more open when they're seeing that you are responding to their needs. And parents, same way.
Understood, Jeff. Jeff, let's switch gears a little bit and go back to your past life and technology a little bit.
Okay.
But in a new sense today with AI and so forth, you seem to be using a lot of AI. You talked about a class companion. How else do you use AI in your classroom?
So, for example, when my students are needing to do a research project, they struggle with what I call white paperitis. They just stare at a blank cursor, trying to come up with this idea of what they want to do. So one of the things I did with AI was my first custom entry into using ChatGPT is I wrote a quick little program that it asked the students a bunch of questions like, what's your favorite movies? What's your favorite types of books? What video games do you play? What sports do you like? And I put a category on there for the type of project they're doing. And then it gives them a list of projects that or topics that might be interesting for them. So that was sort of my first guardrailed venture into AI with my students. And so that's one of the ways I use it. So just something real simple to help them pick when they're struggling at picking a topic. Because I used to have students spend a week trying to decide a topic. And so this way you can start nailing them down rather quickly.
Understood, Jeff. So these are all wrappers that you've written over ChatGPT, or
Yeah, so I wrote a custom app that sits on top of it on a web page that my students have access to.
picking a topic is great. Feedback is something that you've done work with. Where else do you use it?
The third way I've been using it with my students have been playing with it is I did a wrapper so that you could chat with, so originally text with a historical figure. Um, so what I did, my first one I did was with Franklin Roosevelt, and I pulled in multiple Roosevelt biographies along with all primary sources from the Roosevelt library. Um, and then what happens is I set up the prompts that they can't see underneath the covers that basically says, I want you to pretend like you are Franklin Roosevelt and you are talking to a student that's asking you questions about your life. So the students got to be able to chat with Roosevelt.
Understood, Jeff. That sounds like a great way. So using AI to give, to bring personalities to life, right?
And getting a better understanding of who that person was lets you better understand the decisions they made. Like a perfect example that um, I think people understand better is the Cuban Missile Crisis, and well, the Bay of Pigs more specifically, and the invasion of Cuba, and that John F. Kennedy didn't like making hard decisions at that point in his presidency. And so understanding his personality and his his fears of making those types of decisions that might blow back against him really makes you understand the issues associated with the Bay of Pigs much better, as an example.
Jeff, history books then, in some ways, are ill-equipped to give, the complete diagnosis because you can only do so much without it being like 7,000 pages or whatever, right?
Right. And the students will never read 7,000 pages. So uh, I rarely use a book anymore. I try and use primary sources if possible. I do give a little bit of background that I have them read ahead of time, typically online, um, so that they understand the big picture and some of the things, but I try and focus a lot more on the nuance in class. Um, so I think the days of a history book are numbered in a classroom.
That makes sense, Jeff. That makes complete sense. Jeff, let's talk about a topic that you're very passionate about, and it's a very important topic on the risks of using AI. Let's talk a little bit more about that.
So, being a technologist, and when I grew up in technology, technology was the solution to all of life's problems. I always laugh about in the 1980s when I first started getting into computer programming and computers and networks and LANs. I remember vividly the conversations about the paperless office. We are going to have paperless offices. There will be no paper. Everything will be scanned. Everything will be stored in computers. All we've done is produce more paper. Um, I read an article recently about how much paper we produce to print on is pales in comparison to what it was in the 80s. Um, so we have this vision of where technology should go, and AI is no different when it comes to how it actually gets implemented is something different. I'll use another example, move on a little bit later. Spell checkers. I remember when spell checkers first started coming out, um, the education market was like, kids will no longer know how to spell. This is going to ruin them. We don't want them to use spell checkers. Now we've come to accept it like it's secondhand. Who cares? So that is one that you saw it go full circle in the defiance for it and finally acceptance for it. And as an outcome, though, we've been willing to take the kids can't spell at all anymore because they're dependent on the autofill, autocorrect, I'll spell check it when I'm done button. And so we have been willing to accept as a society that that is a weakness that we are going to take because of this technology that we have. AI is in the early parts of what I consider to be the spell checker. There are some people that think it will solve all of the world's problems, while there are other people that think it's going to produce the Terminator and the end of the world. And so that balance between the two, I think time will tell, but we are going to lose something when we use it, just like the spell checker. I find kids, and I struggle the same way. I find that there are words that I've depended on the spell checker. When I need to write it out by hand, I sit there and I have to think for a moment. I've become to depend on it. I used to joke that we need a spell checker in our whiteboard. That the more kids that watch me, the more likely I am to spell a word wrong. And so I just see it in my own life. But as I'm doing Chat GPT to do things that I do as a teacher, maybe not per se my students in the classroom, I know how to do it manually. I've done it manually for 20 years. Now I'm doing it in Chat GPT twice as fast, 10% of the time, but I knew how to do it. And students will lose some of the concepts and some of the ideas as we become more dependent on AI. But should we let that go? We chose to let spelling go at a certain level. Are we going to let some of the things that AI does well go at a certain level? I don't see any more kids cheat than cheated 10 years ago. The same kids cheat. I joke with my students. I tell them, you guys just need to learn how to cheat better. The problem is that the same number of kids cheat that have always cheated. The same number of kids that used to copy paste something out of Wikipedia and leave the subscripts on their answer, or the fonts keep changing because they copy pasted it, are the same kids that paste a prompt into ChatGPT and then paste it in and think I won't notice. So I'm not seeing that rampant cheating that we hear about. You can cheat well with ChatGPT, and I would never catch it. But you might as well write the answer rather than cheating well, because it takes you more time and more effort and energy to do that. You could upload samples of your writing and then answer the question in my writing style with my grammar errors that I tend to make. I would never catch that. I still probably would. But those kinds of things or risk I don't see as much. Those same kids I catch, same number of kids I catch that I always catch. So other teachers might not look at the same level. I can tell you in 30 seconds if a kid used ChatGPT, I don't even need to read it.
How could you tell, Jeff?
Every paragraph is about the same length. I don't know if you've ever noticed that. So before I even read a word and I see 4 lines, 5 lines, 4 lines, 5 lines, 5 lines, 5 lines, 4 lines, I go, okay, that was ChatGPT. I can just tell immediately. Then I don't need to read anything. I joked with a student once. I said, this is before ChatGPT. I said, if you use in your essay henceforth you never wrote it. And I had a student from that point on that decided to use henceforth in every single essay question he answered, just to give me grief. But I think the risk is there. Any technology, we're going to lose something. You have to. Jobs are going to change. You just have to. I tell my students all the time, how do you think the blacksmiths that put horses on shoes on horses felt when the Model T was coming out? This is going to ruin horses. We're never going to need horses anymore. And so technology is going to change things. We just need to evaluate as we go whether that's beneficial to lose it or whether it's not.
Where do you draw the line? And I think the risk that you worry about is, what do you lose from it, right? Based on where we all choose as a society or as a policy matter or as a school or as a teacher, we all may draw lines in different places, right? And what do you stand to lose because of that?
I think what we're going to lose personally is the personal touch in writing. My personality comes across in the way I write. And we're going to lose that when we start doing AI. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that I have not used AI to write a letter home to a parent, um, or write a recommendation letter for a student. Um, I do tweak them and I do change them and I do make them incredibly personal. But when you have to write 80 recommendation letters, you start to make your eyes cross. But the structure and the format, I change and I make mine and I try and put my personality in it. But the bulk of it might come from AI sometimes. Um, is that okay? I think the problem's going to start to come when you receive an email from somebody and you go, that was AI. I'm going to give it less credence than that handwritten email that I got from somebody else. So when the recipient's view of the message changes because it came from AI, is going to be what we're going to lose. That's going to be the risk that's going to happen. And then we joke about, you know, I'm going to get an email from you done with AI and I'm going to respond with AI. So why do we even need to send the email in the first place?
Yeah, it's not a win-all game, it's a trade-off.
Yeah, exactly. And we have to decide as a society, is the trade-off worth it? In AI, unfortunately, the cat got out of the bag before they could evaluate what the impact may be. And in the result also is effect of natural language processing and ChatGPT and those kinds of things ebbed and flowed over time. They weren't very good to begin with. Um, and they iterated and they got better, and they iterated and they got better. Um, we sometimes forget how long it took for the automobile to take hold, and all of the failures that had happened. I always tell my students the first cars weren't gasoline, they were electric. Um, Look at how long it took for us to ebb and flow to be the in car today is an electric car.
That makes a lot of sense, Jeff. Jeff, businesses, employ all these awesome people who have learned, but now they need to relearn and adapt. What have you learned about how learning really happens in the classroom?
I found that relearning I have to do all the time. I found that as I moved up in the corporate ladder, I touched less. I did less of the tactile stuff, but I was dealing much more with management sort of issues and management problems and HR and all those kinds of things that I didn't touch when I was geek. Um, my computer and I were best friends. Then I moved up and I had to deal with people more. Um, and so um, I found that education is a people job more than it is anything else. It is not facts. I will never fail a class because of my lack of history facts. I will fail a class by lack of connecting with them. Um, Granted, I still need to have them learn those things. So that's the same thing I would go back in business and say, look, you got to connect with your employees. You got to understand your employees. It's not so top down as it used to be. When I was first into tech, you went to a company and you stayed there forever. Um, then when the dot-com bubble started to happen, people were moving jobs like water, and we stopped listening to employees because they weren't there very long, or we didn't value them as much because they became much more of a commodity. And so I think those are things that I've learned in education that I think I would put back into business that I didn't have before.
Jeff, the world that the students are going to find, once they go out of high school to college or directly to directly working is a very different world. What should we be preparing the students for today?
Probably they're gonna have to be flexible. That's the number one thing. I mean, even if you work at any business today, the changes in manufacturing, the changes in construction, the changes in technology, the changes everywhere are changing so incredibly fast that no longer are you going to end up, if you're a plumber, doing plumbing the exact same way for your career. There's going to be new technologies, new things that are going to want to be embraced, and you're going to have to be learning constantly, and communicating constantly. And so those things I think are much more important than they used to be. And I think those are the areas our students are going to have to be able to do effectively. I tell them all the time, you're going to have to communicate. It might not always be through an email, but no matter what job you have, you're going to have to communicate, this is not working properly, or we need to maybe look at doing this differently, or some may be email, some may be, less formal, but being able to communicate ideas and thoughts effectively and efficiently are incredibly important.
Jeff, indeed, we live in a very, very fast changing world. And sometimes the dichotomy of that change is very evident. But what about the emotional and social aspects of it, Jeff?
Okay. So I was thinking about the emotional social aspects as you were talking. Students today tend to get frustrated really easily and want to give up, more so than I've ever seen before. Like they'll get their first job and the boss will tell them they did something wrong and then they want to quit. Or they will quit. And there's this sort of social fragility that they have, an emotional fragility that it's hard to correct them and hard to get them to go in the right direction. And that way that, like my first job, you got yelled at when you did something wrong and you just dealt with it and you moved on. Now a kid would quit. Or the parents might show up and yell at the manager for yelling at them. And so it's this weird sort of mix of I don't want to call it entitlement, because I don't think it's that. I think it's just a fragileness of being confident. And I'm okay that I can't do everything right. And I'm willing to accept other people's input that might not even be the best way to give me the input to be better. And I don't know if they're willing to accept that the same way that they used to. I mean, I think of something like sports. The number of kids that start at the beginning of the sporting year and then quit because the coach yelled at them. It's just huge. And so I don't know what produced it, but I see it in the workforce today. They're constantly moving around, constantly, this is not my dream job, so I quit, and then I'm going to go find a new dream job. There were things I hated about my job. There were things I loved about my job. And I was willing to accept that. I don't think everybody's willing to accept that. They've been sold this view of there's a dream job out there for you that everything's going to be roses. And not really the case a lot of times.
The social fragility, and then maybe pushed by that perfect world that social media may portray.
Yeah, because I always use that as an example in my students. There's a movie clip I'll show. It's the beginning of Jumanji, the second one. And the girl is laying on the couch and she's doing her hair and she's doing her makeup and she pulls out her phone to take a selfie and she had like all primmed up and she takes a selfie and she writes, just rolling out of bed. And the students don't understand that what they see is not all rosy. They all want to be social media influencers, but they don't realize these social media influencers put hundreds of hours in their craft. It is their job. It's not like they just posted something and went viral and now they're worth millions.
Jeff, what would you say to teachers who are just beginning today, given all of your experience in tech? How should they be approaching the job differently than, say, a teacher 10 years ago?
My suggestion would be is embrace technology to make your job easier. That would be the way I'd put it. I think 10 years ago when tech was coming in, it was viewed as embrace technology because it makes administration easier. Taking attendance, it still took me just as much time. It was just easier on administration to know who was here and not here and those kinds of things. Embrace tech for yourself to make your job easier.
Jeff, you've talked about a lot of different things. This has been a fascinating conversation. We're going to do something different now. We're going to have a quick fire round of questions. So let's start there, Jeff. Your favorite food?
Favorite food, anything Italian.
A place that you really want to visit?
I have always wanted to see the Great Wall of China.
What's a historical figure you'd love to have as a co-teacher?
Eugene Debs. He was a socialist in the early 1900s, and he's from Indiana. But I love the way he spoke out about everything he thought was wrong. And he wasn't afraid to do it. And in fact, he went to jail over speaking out against World War One, and he ran for president of the United States against Woodrow Wilson while he was in jail.
One tech tool every teacher should just delete right away.
Kahoot. It is like a go-to thing. The kids seem to love it. But what I found is afterwards, the kids don't seem to remember anything that they learned while they were doing it.
A book that changed the way you teach.
It's actually a business book. The business book is called Good to Great. It was something that I read when I was in business world. And then I reread it. That kind of made me look at what was my purpose as a teacher. I wanted my students to be successful, not me be successful, if that makes sense. And that was one of the big models of Good to Great is the idea that I should have taught my students so well that I could be replaced and my students would still be successful. That's really the model of they're looking at for Good to Great from leaders within a company. So I kind of thought about it the same way.
One thing the edtech industry needs to hear from teachers about.
Stop putting AI in their feature list to try and sell their tool. So you get this whole list and it says, we have AI. What do they really have? I mean, it's so humorous how much it gets used today is a feature list to try and get schools to buy something.
What's one historical myth you love to bust in class?
My favorite one is the story of Rosa Parks. I get this children's book on Rosa Parks and her not giving up her seat on the bus, and it like so watered down the story that it's barely even accurate anymore. And so I love like looking at real primary sources after we do the children's book, and then I have the kids write a more accurate version of the Rosa Parks story for kids.
Jeff, what's one AI myth you'd like to debunk?
Teachers think that students are pervasively cheating with AI, that it is so ubiquitous and it's everywhere and all the students are doing it.
Your go-to source for inspiration?
At least for my classroom, it's early game designers. So I like to use games in my class. And so things like Monopoly is a perfect example. I don't know how much have you played Monopoly?
A lot.
Okay. Do you know that's not what the game started out as?
I did not know that.
Okay. A woman designed it to demonstrate to society why monopolies were bad. So it was just the opposite of what the game is now. And so she designed it like that to be a social benefit to society, to be able to see how monopolies are affecting you as a society. And so it was just the opposite of what the game is once Parker Brothers bought it. And so I love looking at some of these early game designers that tried to use games to teach social theory. And I try and do those same things in my classroom. I design games a lot that we play to try and teach things to help them remember better.
Awesome, Jeff. It's been a pleasure talking to you. Jeff, thank you so much for being here. It was a great conversation.
Thank you. I appreciate it.